Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, where one of us is on strike and one of them's living it up in Australia. So that's fucking fun, I guess. Woo!
Woo! I'm having a great time. How are you, Patrick? Which one are you,
Doing
the one on
fine.
strike or the one living it up in Australia?
We're not technically on strike yet, but we did give ourselves a strike mandate, so that's fun.
And
We were
this is the
inspired.
only time we're gonna get actually relevant, politically relevant, I should say. We're always political, but never really relevant since we're usually 150 years behind the times. Support your
We're like
strikers,
100 years
folks.
now. Yeah.
Support your strikers. What are you looking for in this strike, Patrick?
Uh, Generally better respect, right? So for those of you who
Yeah.
don't know, in my regular job, I am a teacher, right? And I make a decent salary, but our salary is not,
Inflation.
yeah, like with rampant inflation and all that, like our salary is not at all reflecting, even with the increases that are expected to happen in our salaries, we're going to be losing money. So we're asking for slightly better pay, not an exorbitantly better pay, but slightly better just to match
Not,
it.
the 30% raise that the MPPs already gave themselves, just a 10% so that, teachers can survive and continue to teach and provide an essential service.
Right. As well as just a general recognition of better respect from the part of government the current government, but this is not just an issue of the current government. It has been an issue long generations in the making in Quebec, at least, of ill recognition and lack of respect towards teaching staff, right? Both clerical and support staff, right? So,
So
yeah, that's kind of what we're doing.
if you
So
don't like,
we'll
if you think unions and strikers are dumb, the very least you can do is just remember to treat your teachers like people, please.
like that's literally all we want is we want to not have to think on the edge of precarity and live on the edge of
Yeah.
precarity, which about 40% of teachers in the college sector that I'm in are facing right now is a state of precarity. So
Yeah.
not great, right? Even with their union help and all kinds of insurance
Mm-hmm.
support, like sometimes it's just not enough. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's what we're going for. So I don't know if people want to email me about it, great. Like I'm happy to answer more, but that's kind of what we're doing.
Just want
Mac,
to
what are
do a
we
small
talking about?
thing. Yeah, to become a
Yeah.
politically irrelevant again, throwing ourselves back by 100 years or so. A little over 100 actually. We're getting a bit closer, folks, now to the main timeline. But
He's
to
not
throw our,
entirely politically irrelevant, by the way, but go on.
we're back on, I guess, what's now a mini series for this show of our ranking of the Canadian prime ministers.
Brilliant.
Now, if people can remember from the last time we did this, we were talking about the man, the myth, the legend, our boy Willie the Legend Laurier, as I like to call him. And so I think we ended up putting him at second, I believe, right?
I think so. I'll pull the list up just so I have it for later,
Yeah,
but I
I'm gonna
think
write
we
it
put
down
him at
for
second.
myself. Yeah, Johnny
Yeah,
McDonald still number one.
that would make sense. Yeah.
Johnny A. McDee's Nuts McDonald is still reigning supreme, followed by Willie the Legend Laurier, and then I think it's our boy Alfred
Uh,
Master Mackenzie for
yep.
third,
And
and
there
then
was a
there's the
bunch of
four,
like, yeah, exactly. The other four.
and then it's the four clown circus. So we're going to be doing another stunning entry into this, the eighth Prime Minister of Canada,
Yep.
Mr. Robert Borden. And this is actually really fascinating because his tenure is essentially the first time we really see an up and comer have to like battle it out with a prime minister and fight a prime minister, like a fight a former prime minister when he's in office. And so there's like a lot of going back and forth among that we haven't really seen yet. Because we saw a little bit with McDonald and Mackenzie, but Mackenzie's tenure is very much a blimp in the long reign of John A. Macdonald.
It's true. Yeah. By the way, I just realized looking at the website, I forgot to update it and put Wilfrid Laurier in, so I'll do that after. But yes, we
Yeah.
did put him at number 2. I remember.
Yeah, and I remember
Yeah.
we had a debate about that. We were debating a long
Yeah.
time whether it'd be like a close. We just decided eventually it was a close second place though.
Yeah,
It was
for
a
sure.
fairly close second place for what he essentially did to stop Canada from becoming a one-party country.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Which, to be fair, in a lot of situations, it is like the liberals have dominated so much in federal politics. And like, it's not that big of a stretch to say this, but we are still technically a
As long
multi-party
as a
state.
minority government requires multiple
Exactly.
parties, we can
Yeah,
still make the
exactly.
claim that we are a multi-party government.
For sure. So what's kind of
Now,
interesting is that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to keep talking a little bit more about Borden, but you can bring up your point
Go
now.
ahead. No, no,
So
no.
I was just going to do a bit more rambling for the Borden intro. And now, as me and Patrick discussed, because we were a little bit discussing what his last name would be pronounced, his last name would be pronounced Borden, is what we came upon on because he is not francophone, so it's not Bourdain, it's not Bourdain or anything else. It's Borden because he's a boring man that borders on insanity and borders on imperialism.
Congratulations. Thank
Thank
you.
you. I'm very proud of my joking and punning. It's the only thing of merit that I bring to this program, along with my lackluster wit and my double entendres.
That's great. That's why we love having you.
Thank you.
But it's kind of interesting because in many ways, despite what we're saying about him, like we're making jokes about him as a kind of stopgap, as one of many stopgaps before the next like major prime minister, then certainly a prime minister that has not gone into history as one of the major ones that people think of in terms of Canadian prime ministers. But he would continue in many ways in the same tradition that Laurier would set up, right? In a way that I feel is quite admirable for someone who did not necessarily agree with Laurier's politics and was actually part of the other political party, right? And would actually create his own different political party eventually. But like it almost goes to show just how much Laurier's influence would be felt even past him, is that Borden would kind of keep the same tactics going, so to speak, in many ways. Yeah, so that's kind of cool, right? And quite admirable, I think.
And as much as we're joking, Borden has one major accomplishment, notch under his belt, etc. He was the Prime Minister of Canada from 1911 to 1920, which means that he was a wartime Prime Minister. And
which is difficult no matter what.
Yeah, that's going to be difficult no matter what, and it is oftentimes thankless no matter what. Like in that, like later on in history, you might be looked upon favorably, but at the time, nobody likes you if you're the wartime leader. The soldiers think you're not, the military people think you're not doing enough to help them. The civilian people think you're getting too involved in the war. Your allies think you're too weak. It's too, like, there's no winning in that time, in that situation, unless you're an unbelievable master like Churchill. You have to be a Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt.
For sure. But what's the advantage that Churchill...
We have our own sort of version of Churchill and Roosevelt for World War II, and we'll talk about him when we get there. I'm very excited for him. But Borden does his best. And he honestly, I think he does a bit better than the other leaders of the great nations in World War I.
Yeah. In some ways, yeah, I think you can definitely make that claim because he has like a double, almost a triple thing to deal with. He has to deal both with the internal divisions within his country, which always exist, right?
Yeah.
Not just Quebec and Anglophone, but other divisions, except he cared about Quebec and the Anglophone Canada. He didn't care about Indigenous people, or any other people. But as well, he had to care about... Yeah, right, exactly. But he had to care as well about Canada's relation to the imperial center, right? Which which other wartime leaders, like in Britain and in the United States, did not have to consider necessarily. Right?
Exactly.
So that's a kind of interesting thing.
So what we're saying is that at the very least, he will definitely be above the 4. Yeah. And I think that's honestly where you need to like align yourself in our ranking of the prime ministers, is that if you end up in a spot ranked below the 4 clowns or the 4 circus cars, you're a really bad prime minister. Like the 4 stand-ins, the 4 cutout store standees, You are actually a bad prime minister, and I don't think you can say that about Borden.
It's true. Right.
Anybody who gets his country through a war relatively well off, that isn't on the losing side, I should say, then
Yes,
you can't say he fucked up too badly.
that's true. Okay, before we get into the actual topic, like deeply,
Yes.
I do want to always remind people that if they want to support the show, they can do so through Patreon
Oh yeah,
or
plugging ourselves.
donations. Oh yeah, like now that people are comfortable in listening, now we plug it, and then they have to listen.
Boom, baby. Plug up. Patrick needs that money to survive.
Pro podcaster move. Support my strike.
We're e-begging, folks.
So yeah, exactly. But honestly, like if you want to support in any way, like you can do so through Patreon.
Yeah, don't feel
we
don't,
just
don't feel
released...
actually needed to, that you need to support.
Right. No, exactly. Do it if you want to. We do the show because we like it. We release early episodes over there, so if you want the show a little bit earlier, that's great. If you want to listen to the extra episodes that we release every month of Pop
In my
Canada,
side series,
that was awesome.
Pop Canada, that's also available.
We talked about
Will Arnett in our latest episode, and it was a lot of fun talking about a great Canadian voice actor. We talked about the latest kerfuffle in Parliament.
One of the many. One of the many that happened in 1 week.
Yeah.
So we got political on that show as well. So great. Yeah. I noticed that. I should say, like, political shows always get more attention because of the nature of politics. But I did notice that our viewership or listenership has gone up more consistently when I actually release interviews that are explicitly political or episodes that are explicitly political. Like it's so clear, right? So I recently released an interview that I did with David Austin, which was about Black radicals in the 1960s in Montreal, and his book about that. And yeah, you could immediately see like our subscribership jumped like by 20 people in just that day, just because people were interested. So it's like we could make so many more listeners just by being overtly political, but that's not the type of show we're doing necessarily. But
we're also not like, I don't want to be somebody who's not smart enough to be political talking about politics. And that's what it
then
is.
You'd end up being a politician.
What people have to understand, when we do the show, we mostly do this through a literary, historical, cultural lens. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we have our fun little haha ranking of the prime ministers, but that's the most overtly political critiquing we will do.
Yeah.
And even that is more just like shits and giggles. Like we are not the Associated Press or any of those other big sites that have actual
political commentary.
Yeah.
You can make the claim that art is political or just like talking about it, but yeah, it's not the same vibe. Yeah.
But no, it's not. It's a different, like when we talk about the political art, we talk about more what the art is saying and less like which slant it has.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair. All right. So just out of curiosity, did you know anything about Borden before reading the notes or kind of delving into this one? Had you even heard his name or anything like that?
Yes, I had heard his name. I had heard his name briefly because again, it was but again, it was mostly in relation to his relationship with the US president of the time.
Yeah.
So like what would his like so when I learned about him, I'm pretty sure I learned about him in a political science class actually, where we were discussing like Canada's because it's the political science of like being in that relation with a superpower. And so we had to talk about the relationship between Borden and the president of the time, which would have been what's his name? Woodrow Wilson.
Yes. Yeah, that would make sense.
And so like what happened in that way, League of Nations, World War I, etc.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you were going to keep going.
No, it wasn't a lot, so it's not like I could say I was had any sort of grand familiarity, but I knew about him at least.
Yeah.
What about you? Did you know a lot about Borden?
I knew that he was the wartime prime minister, right? Yeah. I knew that he's the reason why we have income tax today. Because that was put in. Yes, it was put in at this time. As a spoiler alert for this episode that, again, is about a 100-year-old topic, was supposed to be a temporary tax to help with the war effort. So that's fun.
So if you don't like your taxes, blame the conservatives.
Yeah, exactly.
Political parties are a
so-
sham. Everything's a lie.
Yay. Congratulations on waving your political baton around.
Conservatives, you played yourselves.
And I know that he's on the bills that I see the least of, which is to say he's on the $100 bill.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh,
So
I see those ones all the time.
oh wow. Oh, especially in Australia. Yeah. They use
Yeah.
on the what do they call
have
them?
Robert Borden. He's a great cultural hero here. Well-known folk hero.
Ah, yes. Right alongside Ned Kelly. Mhm.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I knew little things like that here and there, but I have to admit, he's one of those prime ministers that I never looked that deeply into because
Mhm.
I'm not someone who's much interested in military history. And because
Yeah.
his prime ministership is right in that period, I just didn't care much. Right.
Yeah, I'm sure if you looked into Canadian military history, his name would pop up a lot more, especially as we're going to be
Probably.
talking about later. Like he had the conscription crisis to deal with, essentially, and a bunch of other stuff, the Navy. And that's a whole other discussion.
Oh, for sure. So just getting into a bit of his early years. So what I thought was kind of interesting, and I think is something to keep in the back of our mind for this discussion of what he would do, is that Borden was the last prime minister to have less than a university education. Right. He was one of the last PMs to have like what would have been considered a classical grammar school type of education. Right. He did learn things in classics and law, but he never had the higher education that would come to define most politicians later, right? Which I think is kind of interesting to note as far as his pragmatism and populism is concerned. That might be something that plays into it, and also just kind of plays into like the expectations of people in power at the time, that you didn't have to necessarily be this highly educated person. You can get by with a classics degree, right? Or the most basic degrees. But yeah,
yes,
so
the classics, the most basics of the degrees.
I meant for the time.
Yeah,
Right.
I know.
But classics were like, I think that's something actually to highlight as well, is like pre-World War II, the classics were the shit as far as what people considered to be the good job, or like the good degrees.
It was
right?
the
Because
engineering and med school of its time.
no, legit, yeah,
I
because
know.
it was an intellectual thing, right? So you showed that you had a good critical eye and that you were able to think comprehensively and philosophically about different parts of the world, right?
Now it's all about those
Whereas,
stems, baby.
right, exactly. But right or wrong, like before the end of World War II, those more manual jobs were not considered as high end because you would probably end up working in a factory, right? Which is more of a working class position, right? So not exactly the same thing that we see today. But part of what helped Borden, or a young Borden, is that despite his little formal education, his parents did actively encourage him to read and push himself as far as possible outside of the school system. So he was an extremely well-read young man and very intelligent by all accounts that I've seen of him. So his father himself would have been a station master, and he grew up in Nova Scotia. So they had a pretty okay life. They weren't necessarily rich, but they were able to live quite comfortably or quite well for most of their life in Nova Scotia. And Borden would end up going to the United States, as a lot of Canadians did, to start off his career as both a teacher, and eventually he would come back and join a law firm in Halifax. He was quite successful as a lawyer, and he actually only entered politics because Sir Charles Tupper was defeated in 1896, and I should have written this down, but I think he knew someone in the Conservative Party who was like, "Hey, you're a young man, and we need fresh blood in the Conservative Party because these people are old as hell." Right? Like they're dying left, right, and center, as we've talked about on the show before. So we need some fresh blood. And you're handsome and charismatic and young. So why don't you join the party? Right?
Mhm.
And Borden did, but for him, at least at first, it was always a temporary thing. He wasn't planning on making a career out of politics because for him, teaching or being part of the law firm was the career.
Yeah,
Which,
teaching. Woohoo.
yeah, exactly. But I think that's, again, it may be kind of an interesting way to approach politics is when you don't necessarily want to do it full time, right? Wasn't that the Plato thing in the
Well,
Republic?
no, that's the sort of general idea a lot of people have with
Yeah.
things like politics is that nobody who wants to be a leader should be made a leader, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
there's some sense to it, but it's also kind of fucking dumb when you think about it for too long.
No. Like, you're forced into this position. It's like, great, what incentive do I have of actually doing it?
Yeah, and I get the sentiment you shouldn't be going, and the real sentiment behind it is that you shouldn't be going into power because you want to, but more because you want to do good.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the real. But Borden is sort of a non-example because his was a case of he generally just didn't want to do it. But then he got into it
I'll
and he
be a
discovered he
stand-in.
was good at it.
He was good at it and people liked him. And right, he actually led what in Nova Scotia was known as the Liberal Conservative Party in well, more generally, actually, the Liberal Conservative Party, which is what John A. Macdonald had started or had continued
Mhm.
into Confederation. So yeah, he would be the leader in 1901. But he would lose to Laurier's Liberals in both 1904 and 1908, which is obviously the subject of our discussion when we talked about Wilfrid Laurier is that time. Um, and honestly, besides the fact that he was well liked, just within the party as well, people respected him and seemed to like him. So everyone was kind of reluctant to let him go. It's like,
Mhm.
again, he's the only one who's not on his deathbed. So he's going to be the leader for a bit, right? Until we
Yeah.
find someone who's
He's the only one
also
who's like
willing to do it.
more alive and who actually, because people have to remember you were contending with Wilfrid Laurier, who
Right.
is a politician down to the marrow of his bones. This man has one of the longest careers ever served in the House of Commons.
Yeah, exactly.
This man literally was in politics till the day he died. So you have to you need at least have a slightly living person to be able to do anything. And it's
Yeah.
also the recognition of the fact that like you're not going to be able to do much of anything for a long time until there's something so big that not even Laurier can cover it up
Yeah.
or manhandle his way to a victory.
There's something to say as well, like and you see this still to this day. There's like that old joke in Canada is like we don't vote for someone, we vote against someone else, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I feel like that's not just a Canadian thing, but I hear it a lot in the Canadian context. Um,
Yeah.
but part of the joke as well is like you, I feel like you see that here as well. People were tired of the grumpy old men that the Conservatives represented, and it takes a while to get used to the new blood that Borden was,
Mhm.
and so in the face of that, the Liberals and Laurier's charisma and ability to kind of gather all kinds of crowds with his new fangled ideas of liberalism
Yeah. Well,
really
also
appealed to
also
people.
like his personality was also just seemed to be a nice contrast to
Yeah,
Laurier's charismatic one. He in response he was serious public personality, like blah blah blah. So it was a nice contrast. And the fact that he
yeah,
had a personality is a good sign.
yeah, absolutely. And so into when we were talking about his political career, something that I think was really good, and I think that he would borrow a lot from Laurier, or it seems to be a thing that a lot of the good politicians of the early 20th century seem to have gotten, is that they seem to be very pragmatic rather than
Mhm.
dogmatic, right? So you see that a lot throughout history, but people who are dogmatic to their party line often leads to very weird decisions or ones that you're like,
Yes.
don't did you really have to do that just because it was a conservative idea or a liberal idea or whatever, right? It's frustrating.
Yeah,
And
no, it's the idea of picking something because it's the right choice, not because it's the political choice.
exactly, right? And that would really inform most of Borden's career,
Imagine
right?
that happening in politics today. Fucking wild.
Just people actually making well-informed.
Informed,
Yes.
critical
Wow.
decisions.
What a time to be alive that would be.
Yeah.
But despite his interesting perspective on things that kind of tried to balance the good and the bad, no matter whether it was a Tory or a Whig idea, Borden had very much difficulty both in the House of Commons and during election times to actually find a point of criticism um, against Laurier because the good times were rolling, right? Laurier's liberal ideas were kind of opening up the economy in the way that you see still to this day, where you see a boom and bust cycle. Well, under
Mm.
most of Laurier's time, it was the boom times. And so people were happy, but
Oh,
kind of Borden, what he understood eventually was that he had to focus on the eventual bust cycle that was going to come. And because
right.
with every good time, especially in the system that we live in, right, there's always people who want to get rich quick. That's just how things happen. You saw it in like 2008 with the
For
housing
every
crisis.
summer, there is a winter. For every fall, a spring. For every
Exactly.
sunset, a sunrise. For every moon, a sun.
There you go. Lovely. But what he noticed and what he paid attention to in this case in his campaign is that, hey, a lot of companies, and especially railway companies, which Laurier is expanding,
Yes.
are coming to the government with asking for more money and pleading as if they're going near bankruptcy, right? And so the Laurier government was like, "Yep, this is Canada's century. It's coming up. Like, you get money,
Ooh,
develop
Canada
Canada. Let's
century!
go."
World War One and World
Right.
War Two would like to have a word with you.
So for all his exactly for all his pragmatism, like Laurier's government was very willing to just be rather naive with this and just give money to these companies in the anticipation that they would actually fulfill their promises of developing industrially Canada's West and just Canada in general, right? But what you also starting to notice and what Borden started paying attention to in his campaign speeches is that, hey, you notice that those railroad executives, their houses are getting pretty big there, right? For people
Mm.
who are nearing bankruptcy, those houses look nice, actually. Hmm,
I'm not
that's
saying we should
interesting.
eat the rich, but
Like, so what you do and what you see as a kind of shift happening in conservative politics, which had not really been done before, is that, or to this extent, was that he started aligning himself with the grassroots voters in the West, right?
Mhm.
In Manitoba, what would become the like the Northwest Territory, so what had just become Alberta, Saskatchewan, all of that. Um, these people who didn't like to see resources or taxes going towards making a few plutocrats richer. So
Mhm.
again, not an idea that you'd associate necessarily with the conservatives, although the rhetoric perhaps, right? The elites and shit. But the idea of like, going after the 1% is not exactly what you'd associate with a typically conservative idea. And yet Borden was like, maybe not, but it's my key to winning. It's my key to taking down Laurier in this case. Um, and so he would very much align himself with those types of voters, and the premiers of individual provinces would also follow suit. Right, a lot of premiers were conservative, and a lot of them were the ones who actually showed more of a progressive nature by making electricity or telephone services, as well as railroads within their individual provinces, public utilities.
Mhm.
Right. So again, there's kind of been a shift, but this is where the conservatives, for the moment, kind of secured their voting bases, right, into the new century. Um, However, right, and this is again perhaps the less interesting side of Borden. In 1907, conservative kind of rally, not necessarily rally, but the term is escaping me right now. The Congress, I guess it would be, right? He actually announced, along with his conservatives, right, a 16-point national reform bill, or at least national reform plan that would basically be the conservative position for the 1908 election, which sometimes was progressive, right? This position that they set out, which is called the Halifax paper, if I remember correctly. But, you know, in some ways it was progressive by calling for an unpoliticized civil service, which is something that we still try to do today, right?
Mhm.
The civil service itself is supposed to be neutral, no matter who's prime minister.
That ain't ever
However,
gonna happen.
right. But what happened is that it also called for much more careful
Racism,
screening of immigrants.
racism,
Yes, racism.
xenophobia.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So there's the like what we now recognize as the conservative side, right? Although the unpoliticized civil service, you also see that as a rather conservative talking point as well.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
And again, I'm like, yeah, again, in his time, it would never have been seen as xenophobia or racism.
No, absolutely. So the yeah, so exactly. So especially what he was worried about, or what a lot of people were worried about at that time, especially on the West Coast, was Asian immigration, because that was augmenting. There was a lot of unrest in Asian countries at the time, especially Japan. China was just going through a Republican revolution, not the revolution that put in the current government, but a different revolution. So there was an influx of Asian immigrants, and there was what they called yellow panic at the time, which is a terrible term, of course, but that's what they were calling it. And so,
and for
this
whatever
paper
reason,
argued that
this panic continues to this day in many places.
Yeah, I'll remind people of how we talked about Chinese people during COVID-19, and still talk about them whenever we want to criticize their government. But hey, that's an issue for another time. But yeah, what the paper also called for, and this is less perhaps dicey, right, is Senate reform as well as government regulation of railways and telephones, right, similar to what he had noticed in the premiers, right, of different provinces. So cool, good on him, I guess, in some ways. But this would kind of be this running platform. And while it didn't work for the 1908 election, eventually in 1911, because the good times were slowing down and people were starting to pay attention to the fact that the Laurier government was just spending willy-nilly left and right, and that these ideas of unbridled reciprocity with the United States was also anxiety-inducing, perhaps more anxiety-inducing than Japanese immigrants, right, for a lot of people. So Borden really played that up, right? Saying, no, we don't need to make more relations with the United States. We need to secure our relations with Britain, right? We are a part of the British Empire, right? So we need to reinforce that. And Laurier is not doing that. People were happy with that, as well as all the other talking points that I mentioned previously. And so what would also help Borden in his victory in this case was that he was willing to align himself with French Canadian politicians. Laurier had started to antagonize many French Canadians who felt that he was not focusing on them enough, right? Or he was kind of ignoring his French Canadian roots. And so Borden was happy to pick up that slack and say, like,
happy
okay,
to pick up
join me.
The vote.
Yes, absolutely. And Quebec nationalists definitely are ones who would be more willing to go into like anti-reciprocity treaties with the United States in some ways, wanting to not necessarily be overcome by another Anglophone power on a business level. but also just wanting to secure their own rights and their own values in Quebec. And Borden was willing to accommodate that, right? At least on paper. I don't know. Is there anything you wanted to add so far before we get into his tenure as prime minister?
Oh, I had a thought. Yeah, I think it was this sort of Bourdain's victory sort of proves the age-old truth of Canadian politics, which I know you hate, but is an unfortunate truth of you need Quebec to win.
Yes.
And so I think Laurier, that's what brought Laurier's downfall, is he took for granted that base. He thought that was his base, that would be always his base, but it isn't. It's never been anybody's base except the Bloc.
Even then, really
Yeah.
depends on the election.
The fickle Quebecois, or rather the quirky Quebecois, to be alliterative with it.
There you go. Oh, that's good. Yeah, quirky Quebec.
Did you want to chat? Did you want to take a look at the little picture you posted? Or do you just want to dive straight into the politics?
I don't know. Like, is there anything you wanted to add, to say about that one? So one of the,
with these prime ministers, the recurring thing we try to use when we're looking at them is more the political cartoons of the time that represent them more than any kind of like boring article. And in this one, there was one for the Borden's discussion about what to do with the Pacific West and the immigration of Asian people. And it's mostly just the usual, like he's got the Exclusion Act on a rake and he's using it to rake out all the bills for immigration for Asian people. It's not that clever, really. It's not that good.
No, that I have to admit, finding caricatures for Borden was a pain in the ass.
And I think that's really reflective of his personality, honestly. That's really like not as a bad way either. Like he's very much just as straight shooter as straight shooters get. So you can't really like, and even in the pictures that you do find, the joke's more about Laurier a lot of the time or about somebody else than it is Borden.
Yeah, exactly. He's just kind of there. I put them there, but there's not much to say. It's like it's pretty typical racism, like comparing the Asians or Asian immigrants in this case to trash on a beach, right? That you just kind of pick up. It's terrible. And you're like, but again, it's not, I think he's more emblematic of his time, but I think part of the joke of any caricature is that it's outstanding in some way, right? That's kind of what made John A. Macdonald such a lightning rod for a lot of people, is that he was both outstanding in his physical looks, and so you can easily caricature this, but he was doing all kinds of
buck
things.
Wild.
Right. But like he was also just a character.
McDonald was buck wild, man. He was unstoppable.
So it was easy to make caricatures of that. Whereas like if you're just respecting the signs of the times, which like anti-Asian exclusion was very much a part of, it's like, okay, well, we're just doing this, I guess.
Yeah, it's the same way that a lot of people use defund the police as a talking point, even though they probably don't know what they're talking about. It's just a talking point at that.
Yeah, exactly. So,
which continues to be a recurring theme in politics: people discussing debate points that they don't actually understand.
Yeah, exactly. Then next, era, or like the first major issue that Borden's going to have to deal with as prime minister, is not actually the war itself, although this obviously would play a major background to this particular question, which is the question of the Navy, which is what ultimately brought down the Laurier government, or at least one of the elements that brought down the Laurier government, whether or not Canada should have its own Navy or, help fund the British Navy itself. Right? And this next caricature, which we'll also post in the show notes, definitely demonstrates this, right? Which shows Robert Borden staring at this Looney Tunes-esque bulldog that says British Navy on it. And the caption underneath is Premier Borden sees a real dog of war. And behind Borden is like a little frail bunny rabbit that says Laurier Navy on it. Right? Yeah. So kind of actually demonstrating what he has to face here, like support what's already a strong dog or try to make his own little bunny rabbit anything powerful. And so that's basically his major issue going into the premiership.
in the early 20th century and throughout most of the 19th century, Navy was key. Navy was king. Strong
Right.
Navy, strong
Yeah.
empire. So and Canada had nothing. Canada had a
It had like a
railroad.
few things. It had a few things here and there, but it was really not that great, right?
No.
Comparatively. Um, but it becomes a major question, especially with when you have this kind of weird coalition government that's happening of conservatives and anti-reciprocity liberals, as well as Quebec nationalists, all of whom did not necessarily want to help fund a navy that was ultimately just going to support the British, right? Because you either make your own navy and become your own country, or you own up to the fact that you're just not a country at all, right? And you're just Britain 2.0, right? And a lot of the coalition government that Borden was leading was not necessarily in favor of helping perpetuate the British war machine as it stood at the time, right? As the biggest superpower that history had ever seen up until that point. But what's interesting to mention, at the very least, where this is concerned, is that despite the fact that World War One, or the Great War as it was known, of course, at the time, had not officially begun, it's important to keep in mind that people definitely knew that something was brewing, right? We tend to forget that. We tend to think that, like, oh, you know, it's some duke, archduke, sorry, was killed, and that's what set off World War One. Okay, yes, but there were years of political, like a political fire cake that was brewing in order to make that happen. And people knew it at the time, which is why this Navy question is so important, because even though they didn't know when, there was this sense in Europe that another major conflict was going to happen. And so what the coalition government does is basically kill Laurier's idea of having a navy, right? Of funding their own navy that's going to then support the British government. And basically, what they decide to do is that they would send $35 million to England, and they would do what they want with it with their own Royal Navy. Right? So it was a bit of a compromise in this case. So not making your own navy that would just go to help Britain, but still helping Britain and assuaging some of the people who wanted to do that. Right. But at least we're just helping to fund the imperial project rather than participating directly into it, which is not necessarily better, but that's, I guess, the compromise for the time. Right? Do with that what you will. But basically, the what they would do with this $35 million is that it was only given on the stipulation that they would not spend it on the Royal Navy, but rather on imperial defense, which I guess comes out to the same thing. Ultimately, you're helping, again, funding a war machine.
Yeah, I don't. I want to ask you. So, is he just
Yeah.
asking like, don't build boats that aren't part of the Royal Navy? Is that what he's saying?
So built because Royal Navy would help England. What he's saying is like, here, the British know how to build boats because you've been doing it for centuries. Use this money, build boats that will help the colonies, basically, or help everyone
Right.
else.
And then we can have the
Right.
boats when you're done.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of like what they're trying to deal with this 35 million, right? Rather than having to use that money in Canada and build up the industry, which does not necessarily exist yet in Canada in order to build those ships, have England do it. They have the industries, they have the labor, they have all the stuff. And then once you don't need it, well then, maybe those ships can come back to us at the end.
Right.
That was the logic behind it. So ultimately, this would actually kind of go nowhere, right? As most bills, right, that cause controversy do. So Laurier would instead who is still head of the Liberal Party, would kind of call for a Canadian Navy right now. Some of the Quebec MPs actually joined back with the Liberals, right? It was a whole mess, right? There was a whole like back and forth behind the scenes that was making people jump from one party to another all the time. Basically, the Liberals managed to wage what was eventually called the Great Filibuster, and used everything that they could throw against this bill by Borden in order to stop it from actually passing. Right? People were sleeping in their offices trying to make it work, on their desks. As I saw in one book that I read, dogs and cats could have argued with just as little relevance and just as much effect, right? It was an absurd time.
Oh my God.
And this would be like Borden's first great battle, but also Laurier's last, right? And he basically managed to get some voters back by trying to claim that the Canadian Navy should be a thing, and see like the Borden government just wants to defang Canada's national destiny, so to speak. And ultimately it would succeed. The other dominions like Australia and so on would actually send contributions to the imperial war machine, but Canada just kind of did nothing, right? Ultimately, it ended in a stalemate. Laurier didn't get his navy. Borden didn't actually send any kind of money as he wanted to, and everyone just went home grumpy. And no one was happy. And it was just 2 or 3 weeks wasted.
It really highlights like the power of a strong opposition.
Right, exactly.
Laurier wasn't in power as prime minister, but the man was still a juggernaut of his time.
Yes, exactly. So where Borden was able to get some comfort is that despite the fact that Laurier really fought against this new bill, it didn't completely lead to a breakdown in the government, right? Borden's, like kind of weird coalition government that was forming managed to stay sensibly in power, and it did not trigger any like non-confidence election. So Borden was able to stay in power despite this.
Nobody got what they wanted. Everybody was unhappy, but what you gonna do? What you gonna do when they come for you?
What you're gonna do is start World War One, right?
Whoa, World War One, baby! Great War, baby! Let's go!
Let's go!
Never gonna do another one. It's gonna be the only Great War.
This is gonna be a war that's so great, it's gonna end all the wars. So some Serbian nationalist kills some archduke, and people get all pissy about it, and basically war ups at war with itself.
Archduke dies, and people use it as an excuse to start a major war after decades of political tensions.
Yeah.
And those political tensions were in part caused by the rampant conquering of a small Frenchman.
Yep. And
it's so on and so forth, and nobody learns any lessons from any of this.
And the fact that when you have no worlds left to conquer because Europe had really conquered everything, you kind of turn in on yourself.
Yeah.
Right. That's literally it. It's the culmination of imperialism at this point. It's the
downfall of imperialism.
It's the downfall, but it's also an explicit result of it. Right. So Borden kind of goes into the war, right? Again, because of how this whole Navy issue resolved itself, which is to say, not really. The Borden government kind of appears to be on the side of peace, right? And non-aggression, because they've just kind of started the war with nothing, right? Not providing funds, not providing Navy, barely providing men. So it's just like, okay, suddenly he's kind of positioned as a peaceable thing, which is where the next caricature comes in, right? Borden kind of pleading at the knees of the angel of universal peace in this case. So it's something that he would try to argue for, right? A kind of federation, if you will, a league, perhaps you might call it, of countries,
extraordinary gentlemen.
nations, or extraordinary gentlemen, right? That would avoid any kind of conflicts in the future, well, it wouldn't actually be called like the League of Nations or anything like that just yet. This kind of idea was floating around. And the fact that the Borden government was positioned in this more peaceable sense did help continue this kind of rhetoric and idea into the war. However, yeah, nothing is simple in Canada. Right? So
Oh, listen to those quirky Quebecois.
not just the Quebecois. So what happens when your coalition government is formed of Quebecois nationalists who obviously want nothing to do with the British imperialist project, but also you have English Canadian imperialists in your government? What do you do
Oh,
with
gee
that?
willikers. Gee willikers. You just sort of scratch your head and pray to your gods.
And that's what they kind of did. Because basically Borden was stuck between a rock and a hard place. People were criticizing him, as you were mentioning at the beginning of the episode, were criticizing him left and right for not basically doing anything, right?
And this is essentially the problem of having the Borden mindset of not of going like, oh, what pick the policy that's good, not good over bad or right over not the political one. This is where that kind of bites you in the butt, is in these like extremely complicated situations where there's not really good or bad. There's just, and that's the kind of one where having that sort of dogmatic approach means that you pick a thing and you stick to it. And so this is where the failings of the Borden philosophy start to come into play.
Exactly. And ultimately,
I make an
what would
insightful commentary. Yay,
congratulations.
me. Do I get a gold star?
You do. Yeah. So we'll accumulate them. And by when we eventually end the podcast, or if one of us leaves or anything, we'll like put them all on a poster.
I'm a good noodle.
So basically, instead of doing all of these back and forths and trying to negotiate in times of war, what would end up happening is that Borden would kind of understand that a literal great war, as it was called, would make it necessary for the government to take extraordinary powers, right? And as was said by one commentator, if a fire breaks out, you have to send firefighters, not argue about whether or not they're eligible to fight fire, right? That you just kind of have to deal with this emergency and not care about the compromise of it all, which is what Borden ultimately decided to do. So this is where, again, something that would come back in Canadian history more than once is this is where we see the introduction of what we call the War Measures Act, famously something that was invoked in some ways a few years ago, and also about 50 years, 60 years after Borden, right? So both Trudeaus would obviously invoke the War Measures Act eventually, but at the time it had a sensible idea to it, was that, hey, we're literally at war. So we're not going to deal with politics right now. We're just going to do stuff.
Politics, dumb.
So basically, for example, so the War Measures Act was passed in 1914. What the BNA Act said, it was that there had to be an election by 1916. Common practice said 1915 because it's common practice is every 4 years, even though theoretically elections in Canada need to happen every 5. And what the War Measures Act allowed them to do is that for the security, defense, peace, and stability of Canada, they didn't have to necessarily have an election right in 1916. So they could kind of postpone it a little bit just while things stabilized and while they figured out what they were going to do.
Which, fair enough, but we've also seen this is one of those laws that on paper makes a lot of sense, but is very, very dangerous.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, you'll see where this goes. Like, when Trudeau father invokes it, you can argue that that's one of those dangerous. It's like
when Pappy Trudeau invokes this. Oh,
exactly.
Pappy! I can't wait to get to Pappy Trudeau.
Oh my God, it's going to be such a.
Please tell me we're going to have like a 3-parter for Pappy Trudeau, one for each time he's in office.
Exactly. But obviously they can't put off elections for every single year, right? Because they don't know when the war is going to end, but just enough to like find stability. And the what was I going to say here? I lost where I was going to. Yeah. So basically, what they ended up doing is after the War Measures Act, they would send some troops and some help to Britain. But it's really in 1917 that Borden made a really important decision that in some parts of Canada would cause him to shoot himself in the foot or be hailed as a hero. And that is, announce conscription. So this would obviously not do for some people. Can you guess who was mad about conscription and who was happy about conscription?
So obviously the Quebecois nationalists were overjoyed with conscription. They really wanted to help out Britain. They were homies. They were besties. Britain had their back for so long, never tried to like do anything like assimilation or anything. So obviously, meanwhile, the British part of Canada was very much like, yo, you're looking after those Quebecois too much. We need to like reset boundaries here. This is a toxic relationship right now.
Exactly. I think that's a pretty fair assessment of this whole situation, and we can end the episode there without any further elaboration.
This is just to do our due diligence. Let's do a little bit of research.
Yeah, so obviously it's the opposite. This would actually straight up cause like a revolution in the party
riots.
system.
Yes, revolution, like
riots in the streets, but also like straight up radical change in the Canadian
riots
party
in the
system.
Streets, revolution in the sheets, baby.
There you go. So Laurier, never missing a beat, would go around saying that the Conservatives were trying to make Canada a crown colony again by imposing conscription because
I love Laurier. What a legend.
He's not giving a fuck.
The man's there. He's like, I'm in my 70s. I've got like 5 years, maybe tops. Let's fucking do this, man.
I'm not gonna be around much longer. Fuck you and the horse you rode in on.
Borden, why are you doing this to me, Laurier? I don't know. I'm fucking bored, man. I'm in my 70s. I probably got dementia right now. Let's do this. Woo!
So what you kind of see also is as rather interesting is that Laurier would obviously be actively against the conscription bill on principle, but also as representative of the Liberal government, and so would debate against it in the House of Commons. And you already start to see Borden's kind of successor, Arthur Meehan, who will have another episode on eventually, even though he's kind of boring and a bit of an asshole. But he would actually kind of prove his chops in the House of Commons by debating Laurier himself and actually impressing quite a lot of people with his ability to convince Parliament of the necessity of a conscription bill at this time. And actually, the strength of Meehan's position would actually encourage a lot of Laurier liberals to, come to the Borden camp. So this is where we actually see a change in the Canadian party system, which would set the groundwork for what became known as the Union Party, which is a completely separate party to the Conservatives and Liberals. So again, this kind of two-party system is starting to break down a little bit.
Become what we know as Canada today.
Exactly. So changes
did Rhino happen. Party 2020, whatever.
Right, exactly. Unfortunately, the Union Party wouldn't last that long. We'll see that a little bit later, but it was still a change that would.
A great and wonderful party known as the NDP.
No, not the same party at all.
I know. I'm joking. I kid.
So officially, the bill would pass on June 24th. And at the same time, in 1917, in order to help fund this new bill, Parliament also passed the Income Tax Act, right? An act that they said would be reviewed and taken under new consideration once peacetime had been secured. And well, they never touched it again, obviously, because we still pay income taxes on a lot of things. Well, on income.
So
So
you're telling
yeah,
me that the
that's
Conservative Party is responsible for my taxes?
yes, actually, yeah. I think even in Australia, funny enough, I do think
Yeah.
that
It's wild how arbitrary political leanings and allegiances are.
so yeah, it's weird how they kind of change over time.
Yeah.
So
Politics, man.
what's kind of interesting, so you're obviously we'll get into the actual conscription crisis in a minute. I just want to, before talking about that, mention that 1917 was the year of the election, right?
Mhm.
And this is where Borden would run on Union. Was it here that he ran on a Union, or was it a little bit later? Uh, Damn it, I have it here in my notes somewhere, but can't remember. I think it was here that he actually ran on a Union Party
Mhm.
platform and not on the Conservative Party platform. But I can't remember. It was either in 1917 or later, but I think it was in the 1917 one where he ran on the Union platform and won decisively. Now, again, there's a bit of political chicanery going on here. Not that they're bad moves, but he was helped by what was called the Wartime Election Act. Do you know what the Wartime Elections Act is?
No, explain it to me.
So it does two
That's
things.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Never mind. I was gonna say, so we made the joke in Pop Canada talking about Will Arnett that when they, because he does his own podcast, and when they're speaking about complex Hollywood stuff, they say, now for Sister Tracy out there, who's the sister of one of their one of the hosts, we were going to do something similar. For Mother Elise out there, for my mom Elise out there, why don't you explain what the Wartime Elections Act was?
So it does two things. It removes the vote for some people and it gives the vote to other people. Right? What kind of people would you want to remove the vote from during the war?
People who disagreed with you.
Funny how that would work out. Um, Perhaps people like conscientious objectors would suddenly have their right to vote removed.
Mhm.
Perhaps people who had recently immigrated from enemy countries would have their votes removed, like Germans, for example. Um, Perhaps people who were considered suspicious, like radicals from other countries, again, or just like left leaning groups. Maybe they have their right to vote removed, right? So that's really solid stuff right there. But on the other hand, we're giving votes to people such as, you know, women. So that's good, but specifically women who were the next of kin of enlisted men. So there's, bit of a relation there. But it also gave the right to vote to overseas soldiers. So they didn't have to apply to, they didn't have to be there in their home ridings, right? They could just have their votes sent in. So that's good in
And
some
then those
ways.
votes could be like sent into places that the party was losing. For a
Perhaps
man that
one might
prided
say.
himself on his pragmatism, his last election was one cluster.
Right.
It was just bad.
Yeah. So overseas soldiers did not have to have their vote applied to their home ridings. So yeah, exactly like you're saying, like you could just put them wherever. And
Sprinkle it here,
shockingly,
sprinkle it there.
yep, just whatever you want, man. So shockingly, he kind of like smashed the, the election on that one, and he kind of finished off the war. Um, but the war would finish off with a crisis at home. So the unions on the West Coast were very much against the conscription. The sons of new immigrants on the prairies would rather, you know, be on the farm than going back to where their parents had fled, usually, right? And stand in really muddy and horrible conditions, right? The trenches. And of course, Quebec was not happy because of imperialism reasons. Um, and actually, in Quebec, as we were saying, it would straight up lead to full on riots at this point, where, which is not new. In Quebec, violence and politics are not unknown to one another. And there were actually um, there were actually groups that dynamited a pro-Borden publisher's home in the so they were not fucking around. There was straight up terrorism
Let's
happening.
go, baby. Guerrilla warfare at work, sucker. Revolutionary. That's what they are. Don't use the word terror.
I mean,
Freedom fighters.
for Borden they were terrorists. For the people of Quebec, they were freedom fighters.
Civil unrest,
So
baby.
that
Can't keep your own house in order.
straight up no, right?
You know what
And
I'm talking
ultimately
about?
what happened, yeah, ultimately what happened is like it kind of was crushed and died down. And the war itself only lasted another year, right? By 1917, even though conscription had been imposed, like the war was, settling into its final phase, so to speak. And ultimately, once the war ended, which by the way, we are going to be talking about the war proper and how it was perceived in Canada
Oh, it's its
in other
own
episodes.
thing.
Yeah, we're talking about the political realm in Canada right now, but it's its own thing.
I mean, we still
you know,
haven't touched on the most famous Canadian poem of all time.
do you want to actually talk about it? I wasn't planning on it, but do we have to?
Patrick, we can't not talk about something just because we don't want to.
I mean,
It
we
is
can.
it is Patrick. Do your due diligence as a PhD candidate and ask yourself this question. Is this poem culturally and historically significant?
No.
Too bad, we're doing it.
I know it is. Fine, fuck it. I guess we'll talk about it. I'll use it as an intro to one of the episodes.
I'm gonna, whatever episode you do, I'm just gonna railroad this fucking poem in.
In the
If you
middle of
don't know
quoting
which
from
poem I'm
another,
talking about, you're a disgrace to Canadianism and you probably didn't go to a Canadian school.
you didn't suffer the rails of nationalism on Remembrance Day.
Do, 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 do,
Oh
do,
god.
do, do, do.
Anyway, so conscription was a whole traumatic event
Hullabaloo.
for Quebec and the West.
I have
Um,
conscription stories actually, not about World War One,
oh,
but
go
World
for
War
it.
Two.
Yeah,
My
sure, go ahead.
granddad and my great granddad, I think it was the Bouchard clan. Like they have stories of helping draft dodgers from conscription, hiding them out in the woods and stuff in the Eastern Township area, all those forests.
That makes sense. It's kind of weird that like conscription was a thing for both World War One and World War Two, and then later during the Vietnam War, Canada would kind of become known as an anti-conscription haven for like American draft dodgers. It's interesting to kind of consider that shift, but yeah, we can talk about that another time. So despite like being quite successful during the war and being considered, again, pragmatic, despite and at least being able to take Canada through the war despite issues internally. Yeah, Borden was able to make it to the end of the war, but the coalition didn't necessarily survive that long. It was very much a government that centered itself around wartime action. And once that died down, it didn't really know what to do in a peacetime setting.
And that's the problem with most
And
world wartime governments. Nobody knows what to do
yeah,
when the war's done.
yeah. You either change governments or the government that you stay with is dicey as far as like democratic concerns are concerned. So you see that, for example, in France post World War II, right? The Charles de Gaulle government was not necessarily great for a lot of people for a long time. And so one of the things that would continue, right, is that despite the war being over and relative stability being had on an international scale, internally there were major divisions in Canada, namely in the labor market. So it's immediately post-war that you'd see things like the Winnipeg General Strike, which we'll talk a little bit more in detail when we talk about left-wing movements that are rising at this time, right? But it's still important to mention at this point. You know, only half a year before 1919, so early 1919, um, there had been a few order in councils banning meetings and pamphlets that were spoken in enemy languages, which, for those of you who don't get that, is like basically anything that's not English or French, right?
Mhm.
Mostly because these pamphlets were about forming unions, right? Going on strike,
Fucking
securing
unions.
rights for workers, right? Exactly. There were also orders and councils banning things like the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, which was a major union that was starting to form at this time. The Social Democratic Party of Canada was being banned. And anything like this was put into place because of quote unquote helping the war effort, right? You didn't want any dissension during the war.
Mhm.
And that kind of blew up in Borden's face once the war was over, despite what his Minister of Labor told him, which he said, like, everything is fine. There's nothing to worry about as far as labor is concerned. Everyone's happy in Canada. And then,
We're all just a bunch of happy Canadians.
yeah, and then, well, the biggest mass strike in Canadian history at that time happened, and there were literal riots in the streets of Winnipeg over labor issues only a year later. So great job, Minister of Labor, on that one. And
Let's
yeah, it
go,
was a whole thing.
baby.
Yeah, it was a whole
Strike,
thing.
strike, 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 strike.
Oh, it was more than a strike. We'll talk about it. We call it a strike, but it
Oh,
got
we
bad.
got so much stuff to touch it. Now we're getting into World War One, and we're gonna be here for months, people.
You know, it's insane. Um, but there are some positive things. Like from a labor perspective, it wasn't great, but there are some positive things. Borden's government got rid of hereditary titles specifically for men in Canada, which allowed for a little bit more democratization on that field, but also allowed for all women to vote in federal elections
Mm-hmm.
specifically. So before it was just wives of soldiers, and now it was all women. So good on you, Borden government. You did something good, I guess. Um,
You tried.
Obviously, different provinces had their own things to say about that, right? They didn't all accept women's voting at the same time. Looking at you, Quebec. Um, and really, most of Borden's career after the war. So basically, he would stay in office until 1920, but most of it was spent kind of going over imperial affairs. He
Mm-hmm.
really wanted to push for Canada as part of a separate thing, its own representative, right, in the League of Nations, which was forming at this time, right, post World War One. And despite his kind of strong ties to Britain's stance during the war, he did advocate towards the end of his career for Canada as its own thing. Now that peacetime was secure. And he would kind of be one of those voices, as you were saying, that kind of actually resound on an international scale, right? Either against the United States or, as part of an international community. Um, but yeah, ultimately, he was just like, man, this was supposed to be temporary. And I ended up leading the country through a war. So I'm out. Like, I'm tapping out. Arthur Meehan, you seem to know what you were doing while debating Laurier in the House of Commons over conscription, so you take over.
Well, you're gonna see how well that goes, kiddos, because we're about to approach the next challenger to John A. Macdonald's crown. Not Arthur Meegan, but the guy who clobbers him. Like
Oh yeah,
absolutely clobbers him
just fucks up his shit so bad.
and fucks up everybody's shit so bad for so long. Like I'm
I
pretty sure
know,
he's the
it's
longest
incredible.
serving Canadian prime minister.
He most certainly is. Yeah, yeah.
What a legend! What a king!
Not
Heyo.
successive.
Not
Yeah, nice.
successively, no.
No, but in total, yeah, absolutely. Um, no, so what was kind of interesting is that despite one of the books that I read, I think this was from the George Bowerin book that I read, where he kind of ends on an interesting point with Borden. He's like, people think of him as a wartime prime minister, but like John A, he did die a British subject technically, right?
Mhm.
But during his tenure as prime minister, one of the things that was interesting is that he kind of made that term a bit of a problem in Canada. The fact that he was a British subject,
Mhm.
right? The fact that he took Canada through a war that they had to participate in by the very nature of being British subjects, right? They had no choice really in the matter. Um, would ultimately lead him to reconsider his position of imperial unity and turn more and more towards Canada as its own thing. And so the term British became much more of an issue or a hot topic issue post Borden, right, than it ever had been in Canada. And say what you will about him or what the World War, how the World War was handled, I should say. But that's an interesting thing that I think to end on. It's like there is a shift that happens, right? And it's not just
Mhm.
income tax or conscription. It's like in the literal mentality of Canadian politics. And that's, I think, worthwhile. I don't know. I feel like I kind of talked through the end, but do you have anything that you want to add about him before we kind of rank him as
Ooh,
PMs?
ooh. Um, God. I think, yeah, no, I think it's almost misleading to call him a wartime PM because he didn't have a wartime mindset. He is a prime minister that was like in a more peaceful time. He probably could have done a lot more.
Yeah, yeah,
Like he
I
didn't
see what you
like
mean.
he doesn't come across as the kind of man with the strength of will to really be a force of nature during a war.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
because like the truly great wartime leaders, like they have so many faults, so many, but they have like they are a force of nature, and that's what makes them great wartime prime ministers. Like they are made of something else, and they have something like in them that drives them. And Borden never feels like he has that. Borden always feels like the guy who got shuffled into the position and just sort of has been like trying to do his best, which he was.
just like that's literally what he was doing. Yeah.
And he's very much in that position where you can't really say he did much bad, but he didn't really have like much good besides like the income tax thing. It's not like there was a lasting impact of Borden.
The vote, women's vote,
Yeah, I
right?
guess.
Yeah, kind of reshaping a bit of that.
But
Um,
again, that doesn't
yeah,
even feel like his idea.
yeah. There's definitely some arguments to be made about that. Yeah,
Like, because again, he's
it's
like not a super political man. So all those things, all those pieces of like, oh, we're gonna fuck with the voting system and the wartime effort and all that feels like it was almost done by somebody else for him.
it feels like, but I don't know because at the same time, like it would have been pragmatic during the war, that's for sure. But of like, oh, getting more votes of people that'll be favorable to me. But I feel like after the war, it didn't have to be pragmatic. Like at
Mm-hmm.
that point, he made a decision. It was like, okay, well, he kind of cowed to public pressure in this case. Um, and yeah, I don't know. Maybe other prime ministers would have done it regardless, but yeah, I don't know. I see what you mean though. I I have nothing to add on that. Um, anything else you wanted to mention?
I think that's it. We can get into the ranking now.
All right. So number seven, like at the bottom.
Number no, I think above the cutout standees,
Yeah. Yeah.
the quartet
Mhm.
of mediocrity, as it were.
So would you put him above or below Alexander Mackenzie?
I I'd have to say below, I think.
Ooh. Okay. Why? Shots
I don't know.
fired.
I just sorry, clear my throat there. It's gonna sound disgusting. You're gonna have to edit that out. But so it's more just when I think about because Mackenzie and Borden actually share similarities, not in maybe their politics, but in the politics that they faced, and that they were the guys who had to go up against the giant.
Yeah.
And I think in that domain, Mackenzie had more success pushing against McDonald than Borden does pushing against Laurier.
I don't know. I guess.
Because
That's true. Yeah.
Borden has to
Mm,
rely on other people to push back
it's
against
true.
Laurier. He has to send in Megan. Mackenzie pushed back against McDonald on his own, essentially.
To be fair, McDonald did have to face the Pacific scandal. Like he kind of like he was facing a moral panic at that time.
Yeah,
as
but
well.
there's always a moral panic or a
That's
political
true.
panic going on, you know?
That's true. But it did help Mackenzie to come to power and be like, yeah, the good times are rolling, but corruption. He's a he's a he's a corrupt drunkard. And yeah. But I see what you mean. Like I do like toe to toe as a politician, if it weren't for the war, like I do think he's certainly a lesser politician than Laurier.
Yeah.
Um, which yeah, I don't oh, I'm really torn between putting I guess I would put him like if not equal, slightly higher than Mackenzie, but I can concede just fuck it below.
I can go either way. I'm pretty sure I picked it last time when we were ranking Laurier, so I'll let you pick where we put Borden. But
Because
he's somewhere around Mackenzie. Like he's
yeah,
third
for
or
sure.
fourth right now, and that's probably where he's
For
gonna
sure.
stay. He's
Yeah.
got too much in common with Mackenzie to ever be separated from him. I think wherever they end up, I think they should be right next to each other.
Yeah. The thing is, I think in terms of lasting impact, well, as far as capable politicians are concerned, I think Borden had a longer lasting impact than Mackenzie did.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Like
that's fair. Yeah, I can see that.
yeah. All right. I might yeah. I hate the like when it's so toe to toe. I'm so okay. What are we choosing?
I think let's put him third because I think you're right.
Okay.
The lasting impact and the wartime, even if he wasn't a good wartime prime minister, he still was a wartime prime minister, and that's not a small feat.
That's true. That's true. Okay, fine. Let's go number 3. All right. I'll update the website. Mac,
Yes.
take us away.
All right, everybody. Thank you once again for listening to another rousing episode of Historia Canadiana. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or you disagree with our ranking of the prime ministers, please reach out to us on Facebook or by email. What is the official ranking right now? Read it out, the whole list right now for us.
Official ranking is McDonald first,
Yep.
Laurier second, but again, neck
Close
and
second.
neck.
Yeah, like neck and
close
neck.
second. Borden third, Mackenzie fourth, then it's Bowell, John S.D. Thompson, John Abbott, and Charles Tupper at the bottom.
Right. And I think our next one, Megan, might just be the first to end up below the quartet of mediocrity.
There's no doubt in my mind that he's gonna be the new number 8 or number 9.
Yeah.
He sucks.
It's gonna be great.
He sucks so much.
Okay. I like the way our list is developing though. It's a nice list.
Yeah. But yeah,
so if you disagree with the list in any way though, please let us know. We're always happy to hear dissenting opinions. We are not in wartime. We do not require special Congress powers given to us by the House of Commons.
Only.
If you want to support the show, you can through PayPal. You can pay what you feel we are worth. You can use the affiliate links and recommended reading. And if you'd like to, you can always join us on Patreon for extra ad-free episodes, early episodes, and of course, the wonderful side series Pop Canada. But this is, as always, optional, and this show will remain free and independent. Finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes, share with some friends maybe, pass it around word of mouth, that's always appreciated. It really helps our growth. We are not a big podcast, but we love the small, dedicated fan base that we do have. Thanks, Mom. You're always appreciated. So we'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana when Patrick decides that the government is no longer necessary and that we're going to radicalize ourselves and the people to join the Rhino Party. Cheers.
Do you know what we're doing next episode? The one book you wanted to talk about, Barometer Rising.
The incest book.
Yay!
Yay, incest.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everyone.